"It's junk," Specialist Miller grumbled, wiping a slick of CLP from his brow with the back of his hand. He glared at the Browning M2 machine gun as if it had personally insulted him. "The gauges have to be off. There's no way the Headspace is this loose." He slammed the delicate metal "Go" gauge onto the steel workbench with a frustrated clatter that echoed in this cavernous armory. Private Davis, his junior, flinched but said nothing, wisely keeping his eyes on the technical manual spread open before them. The pages, stained with the ghosts of greasy fingerprints, offered no solutions. Around them the air was thick with the smells of solvent, carbon, and anxious sweat. Their platoon was scheduled for a qualification range in less than 48 hours, and their primary heavy weapon was refusing to cooperate. Sweeping near the far wall, almost a shadow in his gray coveralls, was Arthur Pendleton. The rhythmic shush-shush of his broom against the concrete was the only steady sound in the room. He was 82, and his movements were a study in the conservation of energy. He saw the young soldiers, their brows furrowed in concentration and annoyance, and he recognized the posture of a man fighting his own tools. He'd seen it 1,000 times before. "Hey, old man," Miller snapped, not even bothering to look up. "You're kicking up dust. We're working on a weapon here." Arthur stopped his sweeping. He leaned on his broom, his gnarled hands resting one over the other on the wooden handle. He said nothing. He just watched. The young specialist was holding the barrel, trying to screw it into the receiver with jerky, impatient movements. It was all wrong. The boy was fighting the threads, forcing it. Arthur could almost feel the grating of the metal in his own bones. This wasn't just a problem. It was an imminent failure waiting to happen on the firing line, a potential catastrophe locked inside a block of steel. The old man knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut that this weapon wouldn't just fail to fire. It was in danger of a catastrophic malfunction. But the soldiers in their crisp uniforms saw only a janitor, a relic from another time, a phantom who belonged in the background. They saw his worn-out boots and the slight tremor in his hands, but they didn't see the lifetime of knowledge reflected in his pale blue eyes. Type respect, if you believe true heroes don't always wear a uniform. Arthur Pendleton had worked as a civilian contractor on Fort Hadley for the last 12 years, a quiet epilogue to a life that had been anything but. His official title was custodial engineer, a fancy term for a janitor, and he performed his duties with a quiet, unobtrusive diligence that made him nearly invisible. He rose at 4 every morning, his old bones creaking a protest against the pre-dawn chill. The ritual was always the same: a cup of black coffee, 2 slices of toast, and a long, silent look at the photograph on his mantelpiece. A smiling woman, younger than he could sometimes remember her being. Then he would put on the gray coveralls, the fabric softened by 1,000 washings, and drive his 20-year-old pickup truck the 5 miles to the main gate. The guards, young men and women the age of his grandchildren, would wave him through with a familiar nod. He was just part of the scenery, like the old oak tree by the parade ground or the constant hum from the motor pool. His assigned area was the 3rd Brigade's Special Weapons Building, a place most civilian staff avoided. It housed the armories, the repair shops, and the simulation centers. To others, it was a place of intimidating security and loud noises. To Arthur, it smelled like home. The sharp metallic tang of gun oil was a scent so deeply embedded in his memory that it felt more natural than the smell of cut grass. He moved through the halls with his cart of supplies, his steps slow but sure. He never hurried. He cleaned the floors, emptied the trash, and restocked the bathrooms, his presence so constant and so quiet that the soldiers barely registered him. They walked past him, their minds on training schedules and field exercises, their conversations filled with acronyms and jargon that were both new and achingly familiar to him. There was a specific detail about Arthur that most people missed, lost in the landscape of wrinkles on his face. Just above his right eyebrow, tucked into the crease of his brow, was a small pale scar shaped like a perfect crescent moon. It was a relic of another life, a ghost of a hot afternoon in a place very far from Fort Hadley. Sometimes, when he was tired, he would unconsciously rub a thumb over it, the gesture as automatic as breathing. It was a quiet conversation with a younger version of himself, a man who had held the fate of others in his hands, hands that were once as steady as forged steel. Today those hands had a slight, persistent tremor, a frustrating betrayal of age. But what no one in that armory knew, not the flustered specialist, not his nervous subordinate, not the sergeant on his way to check on them, was that in less than an hour the name Pendleton would be spoken with a tone of shocked reverence, echoing through the base command building and changing the entire dynamic of their day. The armory of Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, was a place of controlled chaos. It was a concrete box, painted a sterile off-white that did nothing to hide the scuff marks from countless boots and equipment carts. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, shadowless glare on everything. Racks of M4 carbines stood in perfect, disciplined rows along one wall, a silent army waiting for orders. On the opposite side, locked cages held more sensitive equipment, night vision goggles, thermal optics, and crew-served weapons. The air, as always, hung heavy with the unique perfume of military readiness, a potent cocktail of Hoppe's No. 9, industrial-grade cleaner, and the faint underlying scent of burnt gunpowder that never quite washed away. Today, the usual low hum of activity had been replaced by a sharp, crackling tension. At the center of the room, like a patient on an operating table, the M2 machine gun was disassembled on the main workbench. Its heavy receiver, barrel, and bolt group lay exposed under the unforgiving lights. Specialist Miller and PFC Davis had been working on it for over 2 hours. Their initial confidence had long since evaporated, replaced by a sullen frustration that was beginning to curdle into quiet panic. Their platoon sergeant, a wiry, intense man named S.F.C. Reyes, had already checked on them twice. His last visit had been pointed. "That weapon needs to be test-fired by 1300. Make it happen," he'd said, his voice leaving no room for excuses. The problem was headspacing and timing, a delicate procedure for the M2 that was more art than science. Despite what the manuals said, it was a precise calibration to ensure the bolt closed to the correct distance on a chambered round. Too loose, and you risked a ruptured casing. Too tight, and the gun wouldn't fire at all. The timing synchronized the firing pin's release with the bolt's position, ensuring the gun fired only when it was safely in battery. It was a dance of metal and mechanics that required a feel for the machine. Miller, a soldier who prided himself on following procedures to the letter, was relying solely on his set of gauges. He would screw the barrel in, check it with the gauge, curse, unscrew it, and repeat the process. He was treating the weapon like a math problem, but the M2 was more like a stubborn old mule. It responded to feel, not just figures. Davis, less experienced but more intuitive, sensed this. He watched Miller force the components, his own hands itching to try a gentler approach. But he knew better than to question a superior who was already on edge. The pressure from SFC Reyes was immense, but the real pressure came from the weapon itself. It sat there, inert and defiant, a 50-pound puzzle of steel that held the key to their unit's success or failure. Miles away, in a quiet, organized office filled with old photographs and polished brass commendations, a man was finishing his morning coffee, reviewing personnel reports. He had no idea his phone was about to ring with a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 30 years, a name that would transport him back to a humid jungle and a lesson he had never forgotten. Miller dropped the Headspace gauge for the third time. It bounced off the edge of the workbench and clattered to the floor. "Damn it!" he hissed, kicking the leg of the steel table. The vibration rattled the tools laid out in neat rows. Davis jumped, startled by the outburst. "Maybe we should take a 5, specialist?" Davis suggested tentatively, his voice soft. "Just step away for a minute." "Step away?" Miller rounded on him, his face flushed. "We've got Reyes breathing down our necks and a live fire qual tomorrow, and you want to take a 5? No, we're going to fix this hunk of junk." He bent down, snatched the gauge from the floor, and glared at it as if it were the source of all his problems. He was young, barely 24, and had always excelled in the classroom portion of his training. He could recite paragraphs from the technical manual verbatim, but the cold, heavy reality of the machine in front of him was proving immune to his book knowledge. His pride was stinging, and it was making him reckless. Arthur Pendleton, having finished his sweeping in the far corner, had begun slowly making his way toward the exit. His cart, with its yellow bucket and neatly organized supplies, squeaked softly as he pushed it. He had intended to leave them to their struggle. It wasn't his place. He was a janitor, an observer. But he couldn't help but pause near the open bay door, his eyes drawn to the scene. He saw Miller trying to force the barrel into the receiver again, his knuckles white with effort. Arthur winced. The boy was going to strip the threads. Miller, sensing a presence, looked up from his work. His eyes, narrowed with frustration, found the old man standing just inside the doorway. Arthur wasn't staring, merely observing, his expression placid. But to Miller, in his heightened state of agitation, it felt like judgment. "What are you looking at, Pop?" he demanded, his voice sharp and loud. "This is a restricted area. Civilians aren't authorized in the armory. Get out." Arthur looked at the young soldier. He saw the stress lines around his eyes, the insecure bluster in his posture. He recognized it instantly. It was the fear of failure masquerading as aggression. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, not subservience. He placed his hands on the push bar of his cart, ready to leave, but his feet didn't move. His gaze lingered on the M2, on the familiar lines of the receiver, the powerful curve of the charging handle. It was like seeing a photograph of an old, dear friend. He could almost feel the reassuring weight of it, the solid, dependable recoil thumping against his shoulder. He knew its secrets. He knew its every mood and temperament, and he knew that these boys, for all their training and modern equipment, were hurting it. Just then, Sergeant First Class Reyes strode back into the armory, his boots making decisive, angry sounds on the concrete. He was carrying a clipboard, and his face was a thundercloud. "Miller, what is the status of my weapon? I don't hear the sound of progress." His eyes swept the room, taking in the disassembled machine gun, Miller's flushed face, and Davis's anxious posture. Then his gaze landed on Arthur, who was still standing quietly by the door. Reyes's expression hardened. "Miller, what did I tell you about civilians in here?" he snapped. Get him out of here. Now! This is a controlled space, not a damn museum." Miller, grateful for a target to deflect his own failings, immediately puffed out his chest. "Yes, Sergeant. I was just telling him to leave." He turned to Arthur, his voice dripping with newfound authority. "You heard him. Out! Now!" Arthur met the sergeant's glare. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet calm that seemed to irritate Reyes even more. Arthur finally turned, his old shoulders slumping just a fraction. He began to push his squeaking cart out of the armory and into the hallway. As he crossed the threshold, he allowed himself one last look back at the M2 on the bench. It wasn't just a look of familiarity. It was a look of deep, profound empathy, the kind a master craftsman gives to a beautiful tool being mishandled. It was a look of sorrow. He had built weapons like that from spare parts in the dark. He had kept them running in monsoon rains and choking dust. Seeing it treated with such clumsy impatience felt like a personal wound. Miller thought he had successfully removed the distraction and placated his sergeant. He was wrong. He had just set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the most deeply humbling and ultimately educational moment of his entire military career. The hallway was cool and quiet. The heavy armory door swung shut behind Arthur, muffling the tense voices inside. He was alone with the rhythmic squeak of his cart's wheel and the low hum of the building's ventilation system. He pushed the cart down the long, empty corridor, his worn, rubber-soled shoes making no sound. He stopped beside a large window that looked out over the motor pool. Tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles sat in neat rows, silent metal beasts basking in the afternoon sun. He saw a group of young soldiers laughing as they performed maintenance on a Humvee, their movements full of the easy energy of youth. He let go of the cart and raised his left hand, his thumb instinctively finding the crescent-shaped scar above his right eye. He closed his eyes. The scent of solvent from the armory still clung to his clothes, and for a moment it wasn't solvent. It was the thick, humid smell of jungle rot and diesel fumes. The air wasn't cool and conditioned. It was heavy and wet, clinging to his skin like a second uniform. He wasn't standing on polished linoleum, but on the vibrating steel floor of a helicopter. The low hum of the building became the deafening whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of huey rotor blades chopping through the air. He felt the familiar weight of the M2's spade grips in his hands, the metal warm and alive. He remembered the darkness, a night with no moon, somewhere west of Quezon. The gun had jammed, a catastrophic stoppage mid-firefight. Tracers were cutting green lines through the blackness all around them. The gunner, a kid from Ohio named Miller, a strange coincidence of names across 50 years, was panicking. Arthur had pushed him aside, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision in the absolute dark. He hadn't needed to see. His fingers knew the landscape of the weapon by heart. He'd cleared the ruptured case, checked the chamber, reseated the belt of ammunition, and reset the headspace and timing all by feel. The entire process had taken less than a minute. The gun had roared back to life, a comforting, thunderous sermon of defiance. He opened his eyes. The motor pool was still there, the laughing soldiers, the squeaky cart. He looked down at his hands. The tremor was there, a constant, frustrating companion, but in the memory his hands had been perfectly, unnaturally still. He knew what was wrong with that gun back in the armory. He knew it as surely as he knew his own name. It wasn't just a technical problem. It was a disharmony in the machine, a lack of respect. And the thought of that beautiful, powerful weapon being silenced by simple ignorance was more than he could bear. He turned his cart around and started pushing it slowly, deliberately back toward the armory door. He didn't knock. The door had been left propped open a few inches, a testament to the frazzled state of the soldiers inside. The sound of Miller's voice, tight with frustration, carried into the hall. "I'm telling you, Sergeant, the firing pin is striking too shallow. The protrusion is within spec, so it must be a worn solenoid." Arthur stopped just outside the door, hidden from view. He closed his eyes and shook his head slowly. A worn solenoid. The boy was just guessing now, throwing out technical terms, like Hail Mary passes. He was miles from the actual problem. The solenoid was an electrical component related to remote firing. It had nothing to do with a shallow primer strike during manual operation. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the weapon system. He couldn't stay silent. It wasn't about pride or showing them up. It was about the integrity of the machine. It was about the safety of the soldiers who would one day depend on it. He took a half step into the doorway, not fully entering the room but making his presence known. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the tense air with the clarity of a ringing bell. It was raspy with age, but steady with conviction. "It's not the solenoid," Arthur said. "Your timing is off. The firing pin is releasing a fraction of a second too early, before the bolt is fully in battery. That's why the strike is shallow." SFC Reyes and Specialist Miller spun around as one. Their faces were a mixture of shock and incandescent fury. That the janitor had not only returned, but had the audacity to interrupt and contradict them was an offense of the highest order. The worst part wasn't the gall of the old man. It was the condescending, incredulous laugh that escaped from Miller. He threw his head back and chuckled, a harsh, ugly sound. "And what would a janitor know about a Modus?" he sneered, looking at Reyes for backup. He had no idea he was speaking to the man who, 35 years earlier, had co-authored the very field manual update they were failing to properly interpret. SFC Reyes's face had gone from red to a dangerous mottled purple. The insubordination was one thing, but the public challenge to his and his soldiers' competence, coming from a janitor, was an intolerable breach of the established order. This had moved beyond a simple workplace issue. It was now a matter of discipline. "That's it," Reyes barked, his voice low and menacing. He pointed a rigid finger at Arthur. "You don't move." He then turned to the younger soldier. "Davis, get his ID. I'm calling his civilian supervisor and the provost marshal. This man is done on this base. We're getting him written up for interfering with military operations and trespassing in a restricted area." Davis, who had been watching the exchange with a growing sense of unease, hesitated for a fraction of a second. The old man's words, despite his appearance, had rung with an unnerving confidence, but an order was an order. "Yes, Sergeant," he mumbled, avoiding everyone's eyes. He walked over to Arthur, who was still standing calmly in the doorway. "Sir, I need to see your ID card," Davis said, his voice polite, almost apologetic. Arthur looked at the young private, his gaze soft with something that might have been pity. He reached into the back pocket of his coveralls, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and extracted a laminated civilian contractor ID card. He handed it to Davis without a word. Davis took the card and walked back to the workbench. He read the name printed beneath the unflattering photograph. "Name is Pendleton Arthur J." Reyes snatched the card from his hand. "Pendleton," he repeated, tasting the name with disgust. He pulled his radio from his belt. "Sergeant Reyes to PMO, over." The radio crackled to life. "PMO, go for Sergeant Davis." "Yeah, I need you to run a name for me," Reyes said, his voice clipped and official. "Civilian contractor. I'm filing a report for a security violation. Last name Pendleton. Pendleton. First name Arthur. Arthur. Got an ID number for you." He read the number off the card. There was a pause. Then the voice from the radio replied, "Roger that. Stand by." In the provost marshal's office, a young specialist at a dispatch console typed the name into the base security database. He expected to see a simple profile: photo, date of birth, employer, access level. But as soon as he hit enter, his screen flashed bright red. A large pop-up window covered the entire monitor with bold letters at the top: "Flagged personnel. Do not detain. Immediate notification required." Below it was a single line of instruction: "If this individual is encountered, contact Base Sergeant Major Callahan directly on his personal line, regardless of time or circumstance." The young specialist's eyes went wide. He had never seen a flag like this. He fumbled for the phone, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. While Reyes waited for the radio response, Miller decided to heap more scorn on the old man. He felt a surge of vindictive pleasure. The janitor's interruption had given him a perfect scapegoat for his own failures. "So you're an expert now, Grandpa," Miller taunted, picking up the complex timing gauge and waving it in Arthur's direction. "Gonna show us how it's done with your magic broom? You even know what this is?" Arthur didn't rise to the bait. His gaze remained fixed on the M2, his expression unreadable. The taunts, the threats, they were just noise. The only thing that mattered was the silent, broken machine on the table. It needed a proper touch, a knowing hand. After a moment of silence that stretched uncomfortably long, he finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm, directed not at Miller but at the weapon itself. "Let me see it." Reyes let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. You're in enough trouble as it is, old man. You aren't touching a piece of U.S. military property. Now back up and wait for the MPs." He took a step toward Arthur, using his physical presence to intimidate. The air in the room was thick with hostility, a standoff between youthful arrogance and aged wisdom. They were so wrapped up in their own small drama, so convinced of their authority, that they didn't hear the distant sound of a siren. They didn't let him touch the weapon. Not yet. The soldiers stood their ground, a wall of uniformed pride and procedure. But what none of them knew was that in exactly 7 minutes, a black command vehicle, its emergency lights flashing silently, would squeal to a halt outside their building, and when its passenger door opened, SFC Reyes would begin to fervently wish he had just let the old man look at the damn gun. The 7 minutes that followed were a master class in uncomfortable silence. Reyes stood with his arms crossed, glaring at Arthur as if he could make him evaporate through the sheer force of will. Miller busied himself by pretending to reread the technical manual, though his eyes kept flicking up to shoot scornful glances at the old janitor. Davis just tried to make himself as small as possible, standing by a rack of rifles and wishing he were anywhere else on earth. Arthur, for his part, simply waited. He leaned against the doorframe, his posture relaxed, his breathing even. He had seen this kind of stubborn pride before. He had seen it in young lieutenants who thought they knew more than their seasoned sergeants, and he had seen it in his own reflection as a young man. He knew it was a brittle thing, easily shattered by the hard hammer of reality. The first sign that reality was about to intrude was the sound of tires screeching on asphalt just outside the armory's loading bay. It was the sound of a vehicle stopping with a purpose that was far from routine. Reyes and Miller exchanged a confused look. They were expecting a standard MP patrol car, not the heavy-duty SUV that belonged to the base command group. The armory door was flung open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall with a resounding crash. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun, was a figure that made every soldier in the room instinctively stiffen to a position of attention. It was Sergeant Major Callahan, the highest-ranking enlisted soldier on the entire installation. He was a man whose reputation preceded him everywhere he went, a veteran of multiple combat tours, built like a fire hydrant, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain. He wasn't angry. He was something far more terrifying. He was moving with an urgent, focused intensity that radiated palpable energy. His eyes, the color of faded fatigues, swept the room in a single, comprehensive glance. He took in the disassembled weapon, the flustered soldiers standing ramrod straight, and then his gaze landed on Arthur. He stopped dead. The intense forward momentum ceased as if he had run into an invisible wall. His eyes, which had been scanning for a threat or a problem, now narrowed in disbelief. He looked at the gray janitor's coveralls, the stooped shoulders, the wrinkled face. Then his eyes traveled up, locking onto the small crescent-shaped scar just above Arthur's right eyebrow. The sergeant major's entire demeanor shifted. The hard command presence dissolved, replaced by something else, something softer. A look of profound, jaw-dropping recognition. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. The loud, authoritative voice that could command a battalion across a windy parade field was now quiet, filled with a tone of awe and reverence that shocked Miller and Reyes to their cores. "Mr. Pendleton?" Callahan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Arthur Pendleton?" Arthur, who had straightened up slightly at the sergeant major's arrival, gave a small, slow nod. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. Callahan stared for another long moment, his mind clearly racing, connecting a face from the present with a name from legends he'd heard as a young soldier. He then slowly, deliberately turned his head to face the two stunned NCOs. The command presence was back, but now it was amplified by a cold, controlled fury that was far more frightening than any shouting. His voice was dangerously low. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he asked, not as a question but as an indictment. Miller and Reyes were paralyzed, speechless. Their brains couldn't process the scene. The base sergeant major was speaking to their janitor with the deference one might reserve for a visiting general. Callahan didn't wait for an answer. He jabbed a thick, powerful finger in Arthur's direction. "This is Chief Warrant, Officer 5 Arthur Pendleton, retired." Each word landed like a hammer blow. He was the senior ordnance and armament warrant for the 5th Special Forces Group for 20 years. Before that, he was with MACVSOG. He didn't just fix weapons, he built them. He designed half the custom modifications and field expedient repairs that you amateurs are still trying to figure out from faded manuals. He took a step closer to Miller, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "You see that scar on his forehead?" Callahan's voice dropped even lower, becoming intensely personal. "He got that from a piece of shrapnel while he was pulling a wounded gunner out of a burning Huey in the Ashau Valley back in '68. He was under fire, covered in aviation fuel, and he still got the man out. And the weapon he had been firing just moments before, the one he got running again in the middle of that firefight, it was a Browning M2, just like that one. He gestured dismissively at the collection of parts on the workbench. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the incessant hum of the overhead lights. But what Miller didn't see as he stared at the floor in abject horror was the look in Sergeant Major Callahan's eyes, a look that said the history lesson was only just beginning and that class was now painfully in session. Callahan let the weight of his words settle in the suffocating silence. He watched the color drain from the faces of Reyes and Miller. He saw the slow dawn of understanding and shame in their eyes. Young Davis looked like he had just seen a ghost, his mouth slightly agape as he stared at the old man who, just minutes before, had been an invisible fixture of his daily life. The sergeant major turned his back on the younger soldiers, a gesture of complete dismissal, and faced Arthur fully. The hard lines on his face softened into an expression of profound respect. "Chief," he said, the honorific title feeling more natural on his tongue than "Mister," "I apologize for my soldiers. They are new. They don't know the history." Arthur offered a slight shake of his head. "They're just kids, Sergeant Major, doing their job." "No," Callahan countered, his voice firm. "Their job is to maintain that weapon, a job at which they are currently failing." He paused, then gestured with an open hand toward the cluttered workbench. "Chief Pendleton, if you're willing, would you do us the honor?" It wasn't an order. It was a request, offered with the humility of a student asking a master for a demonstration. Arthur looked at Callahan, then at the M2. He felt the familiar pull, the quiet call of the machine. He gave a single, slow nod. He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked toward the workbench. His movements were still slow, still marked by the stiffness of age, but there was a new purpose in his step. The soldiers parted before him like the Red Sea. When he reached the bench, he placed his hands on the cold steel of the receiver. For a moment he just stood there, his eyes closed, as if reacquainting himself with an old friend. The slight tremor that had been a constant in his hands for years simply vanished. His fingers became perfectly, preternaturally still. He didn't reach for the gauges, he didn't consult the manual. He worked purely by touch and sound, his hands moving with an economy and grace that was mesmerizing to watch. He picked up the heavy barrel, his gnarled fingers finding the threads with an unerring certainty. He began to screw it into the receiver, not with force, but with a gentle, patient guidance. He turned it slowly, his head cocked to the side, listening. He was listening to the clicks of the threads engaging, feeling for the precise point of contact through the steel. He retracted the bolt group slightly, his other hand still on the barrel, making a minute adjustment. There was a solid, resonant thunk as the bolt seated. He closed the feed tray cover, the click of the latch sounding like a final, authoritative punctuation mark. He cycled the charging handle once, twice. The action was impossibly smooth, a powerful rhythmic slide of perfectly aligned metal. The entire process had taken no more than 30 seconds. He stepped back from the bench. "It's set," he said, his voice a quiet statement of fact. Miller and Reyes stared, their faces masks of disbelief. It was impossible. They had been fighting with it for hours. This old man had fixed it in less time than it took to read a single paragraph in the manual. Davis, however, wasn't looking at the gun. He was looking at Arthur's hands. They were resting on the edge of the bench now, and the tremor had returned, a subtle, gentle shaking. It was as if the weapon had borrowed his strength and his stillness For a moment, Sergeant Major Callahan walked to the workbench. He picked up the go gauge, the one Miller had slammed down in frustration. He slid it into the breech. It fit perfectly, stopping precisely where it should. He set it down and picked up the red-tagged no-go gauge. He tried to insert it. It wouldn't go, stopping at the exact tolerance specified by the weapon's design. He then tried the field timing gauge, checking the relationship between the trigger and the firing pin release. Perfect. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply stood there, absorbing the quiet competence of the work. Then he turned his head and pinned SFC Reyes with an icy glare. "You were going to have him barred from this base," he said, his voice flat and cold. Reyes flinched as if struck. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at the floor, the polished concrete suddenly the most interesting thing in the world. Callahan then shifted his gaze to Specialist Miller. "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You called him Grandpa. You were going to teach him about this weapon." Miller was pale, his face slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Shame radiated from him in palpable waves. He couldn't meet the sergeant major's eyes. He felt inches tall, his arrogance and pride stripped away, leaving him exposed and utterly humiliated. He had not just been wrong. He had been disrespectful to a living legend, a man whose boots he wasn't worthy of cleaning. For the first time in his military career, Miller was truly, profoundly humbled. Callahan wasn't finished. His expression was grim, his mind already formulating a plan. This was not just a moment for correction. It was a moment for education, a lesson that needed to be seared into the memory of every soldier in the room. He pointed a finger at Reyes. "Get the company commander on the phone. Now, I want him down here." Then he turned his steely gaze back to a trembling Specialist Miller. "And you," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument, "you're not going anywhere. Your real training starts now." The days that followed were a quiet revolution in the Bravo Company armory. Specialist Miller was not formally punished, not in a way that would appear on paper. Sergeant Major Callahan was too wise for that. Instead, he arranged for a far more effective form of correction. Miller was assigned to 1 month of special duty, a temporary reassignment that put him directly under the informal supervision of Arthur Pendleton. His duties were simple. For 4 hours every day after his regular shift, he was to report to Arthur. He wasn't to fix weapons. He was to clean the armory and listen. At first, the silence between them was thick and heavy with Miller's humiliation. He would mop the floors and clean the workbenches while Arthur quietly went about his own custodial duties. But Arthur never mentioned the incident. He never gloated or said, "I told you so." Instead, after a few days of silence, he started to talk. He would be polishing a window and would mention, almost to himself, how the humidity in the summer could affect the lubricant on a bolt carrier group. Or he would be emptying a trash can and would recall a time in the Highlands when they had to use captured enemy motor oil to keep their M60s running. Miller, initially sullen, began to listen. He heard stories that weren't in any manual. Arthur taught him about the personality of machines, how each weapon had its own quirks, its own unique feel. He taught him to diagnose problems not just with gauges, but with sound and touch. He would have Miller close his eyes and just cycle the action of an M4, telling him to feel for the subtle hitch that signaled a burr on the feed ramp, or to listen for the specific pitch of the buffer spring that meant it was nearing the end of its service life. He was teaching him the art, not just the science. Miller learned humility. He learned to respect the wisdom that came not from a classroom, but from a lifetime of experience. His hands, once clumsy and impatient, became more confident, more attuned to the machines he worked on. P.F.C. Davis, profoundly affected by what he had witnessed, put in a request for the advanced gunsmithing course at Aberdeen Proving Ground. In his request form, under the section asking for his motivation, he wrote, "I want to understand the spirit of the machine, not just its mechanics." The story of the incident spread through the base like wildfire, passed in hushed, respectful tones from the chow hall to the firing ranges. It became a piece of Fort Hadley folklore, the legend of the ghost armorer, the old janitor who could time a 50 cal by feel. Arthur Pendleton found his quiet life had changed. He still pushed his squeaky cart and wore his gray coveralls, but now when he passed soldiers in the hallway, they no longer looked through him. They met his eyes. They nodded. Sometimes a young lieutenant or a seasoned sergeant would stop him, offering a simple, "Good morning, Chief," the honorific now a mark of earned and freely given respect. The salutes became more frequent, crisp and perfect, offered not to a rank he no longer wore, but to the man he had always been. A month after the incident, Arthur was making his early morning rounds. The sun was just beginning to cast long shadows across the parade ground. As he passed the 3rd Battalion headquarters, SFC Reyes stepped out. He was holding 2 steaming styrofoam cups. He walked over to Arthur, his expression hesitant, a stark contrast to the aggressive certainty he had displayed in the armory. He held out one of the cups. "Coffee, Chief?" he asked, his voice quiet. Arthur stopped his cart and took the cup, his gnarled fingers wrapping around its warmth. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, watching the flag being raised in the distance. The sounds of the base waking up, the rumble of engines, the distant cadence of a platoon on a run, filled the air. "I learned something that day," Reyes said finally, not looking at Arthur but at the flag. "Something they don't teach you at the NCO Academy." Arthur took a slow sip of the hot coffee. He didn't need to ask what it was. He just nodded. The lesson had been delivered. He looked down at his own hands, holding the cup. They were steady. The tremor was gone, at least for now. He was just an old janitor, a man in the twilight of his life, but he knew that the quiet echoes of his service, the lessons learned in blood and sweat and steel, could still make a difference. The true measure of a hero isn't the medals on a uniform, but the wisdom they choose to share and the respect they quietly command long after the uniform has been put away. Stories like this are a powerful reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often in the most unexpected places. The quiet professionals, the humble veterans, the masters of a craft who ask for no recognition. They are the bedrock of our communities. They teach us that true strength isn't about arrogance or authority, but about quiet competence, dignity, and a lifetime of service. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales that honor the quiet heroes and the enduring power of respect.